Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode. Today we'll be talking about the juvenile justice system and reform and mass incarceration and prison reform, so let's get started. The juvenile justice system is an area of criminal law designed for individuals who engage in delinquent behavior before adulthood. Unlike the adult system, it emphasizes rehabilitation over punishment. The process involves arrest, potential detention, and adjudication in specialized juvenile courts. If found delinquent, the court determines a suitable disposition, prioritizing rehabilitation through probation, counseling, or correctional facilities. The goal is to address underlying issues and support successful reintegration into society. Some jurisdictions allow for the expungement of juvenile records to offer a fresh start in adulthood, which shows the system's focus on positive change and development. The historical context of juvenile justice reflects a significant shift in societal attitudes and legal approaches. In the 19th century, juveniles were often treated similarly to adults in criminal justice system, facing harsh punishments. The establishment of the first juvenile court in Chicago in 1899 marked a turning point. The juvenile court aimed to focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment, recognizing the unique needs of young offenders. This approach spread across the United States and internationally. Over time, however, concerns about due processes and fairness led to some blending of juvenile and adult systems. Recent decades have seen a renewed emphasis on rehabilitation and alternatives to incarceration in response to evolving perspectives on youth development and justice. As mentioned before, the components of the juvenile justice system are arrest, detention, court, and rehabilitation. The process begins with the arrest of a juvenile who is suspected of committing a delinquent act. Law enforcement officers are responsible for apprehending the individual, and the circumstances surrounding the arrest are typically different from those in the adult system. After an arrest, juveniles may be held in a detention center while awaiting court proceedings. Detention serves the dual purpose of ensuring the juvenile's appearance in court and protecting the community. The conditions in juvenile detention are intended to be more focused on rehabilitation than punishment. Juvenile court operates separately from adult criminal courts. The court process involves an adjudication hearing akin to a trial in the adult system. Instead of a guilty verdict, the court determines whether the juvenile is delinquent based on the evidence presented. The court takes into account factors such as the severity of the offense, the juvenile's age, and their background. Rehabilitation is a central component of the juvenile justice system. Once a juvenile is found delinquent, the court decides on an appropriate disposition. This may include probation, community service, counseling, or placement in a juvenile correctional facility. The overarching goal is to address the underlying issues that may have contributed to the delinquent behavior and facilitate the juvenile's successful reintegration into society. Procedures in juvenile courts are typically more informal, and the focus is on addressing underlying issues to prevent future delinquency. Additionally, juvenile records may be expunged or sealed, providing a fresh start in adulthood. The goal is to balance accountability with support for positive development and successful reintegration into society. However, juveniles navigating the justice system often encounter a range of challenges that can significantly impact their experiences and outcomes. One prevalent issue is the lack of adequate legal representation, leaving many juveniles without the necessary guidance to navigate complex legal processes. Additionally, disparities based on race and socioeconomic status persist, raising concerns about systemic biases within the system. Some juveniles face harsh sentencing that may not be considered their developmental stage or potential for rehabilitation. Conditions in detention centers vary widely, with reports of overcrowding and limited access to essential services. Many juveniles in the system have experienced trauma or struggled with mental health issues, which may not be sufficiently addressed. The school-to-prison pipeline exacerbates these challenges, limiting educational and personal growth opportunities. Access to rehabilitation programs and support services is often limited, hindering the system's effectiveness in addressing the root causes of delinquency. Moreover, the collateral consequences of a juvenile record can have lasting impacts on future opportunities, contributing to a cycle of involvement with the criminal justice system. Addressing these issues requires a concerted effort to promote equity, improve access to resources, and prioritize rehabilitation within the juvenile system. Now let's talk about the effectiveness of punitive measures. The effectiveness of punitive approaches in rehabilitating juveniles offenders have been a subject of ongoing debate within the criminal justice system. Punitive measures such as incarceration and strict sentences often aim to deter criminal behavior through punishment. However, when applied to juvenile offenders, there could be significant drawbacks. Punitive approaches may not address the underlying factors that contribute to the juvenile delinquency, such as family issues, trauma, or mental health challenges. Instead of focusing on rehabilitation and addressing these root causes, punitive measures can exacerbate existing problems and hinder the juvenile's chances of successful reintegration into society. On the contrary, restorative justice is an innovative approach to addressing wrongdoings that centers on repairing harm, promoting accountability, and fostering healing within the community. Restorative justice emphasizes open dialogue and communication between the victim, offender, and relevant community members. Rather than solely focusing on punishment, the process encourages the offenders to take responsibility for their actions and actively participate in making amends. Community involvement is a key aspect, allowing for collective problem-solving and reinforcing community bonds. The ultimate goal of restorative justice is rehabilitation, seeking to address the root causes of the offender's behavior and facilitate their positive reintegration into society. This stands in contrast to traditional punitive measures, which often prioritize retribution, isolation through incarceration, and limited focus on rehabilitation, contributing more to an adversarial and punitive justice system. So what role does advocacy groups and grassroots movement play in pushing for juvenile justice reform? Advocacy groups and grassroots movement play a pivotal role in shaping juvenile justice system reform by actively challenging and addressing systemic issues within the system. These groups serve as catalysts for change by raising public awareness about the shortcomings of punitive measures and advocating for a more rehabilitative approach. Engaging in policy advocacy, they work closely with lawmakers to push for legislative reforms that prioritize the unique needs of young individuals within the justice system. By mobilizing communities, these movements empower individuals to voice concerns and collectively demand changes, fostering a sense of community ownership over the reform processes. Advocacy groups also play a critical role in legal challenges, initiating lawsuits and supporting court decisions that set precedents, favoring fair and equitable treatment for juveniles. Through media engagement, they share narratives, statistics, and research that underscore the necessity for reform, influencing public opinion and garnering support for systemic changes. Additionally, these groups often collaborate with diverse stakeholders, monitor the implementation of reforms, and provide direct support to at-risk youth, creating a comprehensive and dynamic movement that advocates for a more compassionate, equitable, and developmentally appropriate juvenile justice system. Now let's move on to mass incarceration and prison reform.
So in simpler terms, the criminal justice system is the way in which a government responds to crime. And a typical criminal justice system would usually consist of 3 parts. The first of which being law enforcement, which is basically known as cops. And as we all know, the purpose of cops is to essentially prevent crime, and there are laws made to do so. And this part of the criminal justice system is what makes the arrest and collects evidence. And that moves on to the second part, being the judicial or courts. And the courts basically hears the evidence and applies this specific case to the law and determines the sentencing. And the final part of the criminal justice system is corrections, which is custody and control, so essentially rehabilitation of criminals. And I'm going to be focusing more on this today. And so a big part of corrections is prison, and I'm going to be talking about the different prison reforms. So prison reform involves making changes to the criminal justice system and the conditions within prisons to address issues such as overpopulation or mass incarceration, inhumane treatment, and the lack of rehabilitation. And here are some key aspects of prison reform. The first one would most likely be improving conditions, so things like healthcare access to ensure access to quality healthcare services for inmates, addressing both physical and mental health needs. And the second being prison infrastructure, which is essentially upgrading and maintaining prison facilities to provide safe and humane conditions for inmates. The second possible reform would be rehabilitation programs, so things like education and vocational training that implements programs that offer educational opportunities and vocational training to inmates, preparing them for successful reintegration into society. And the second could be counseling and mental health services, which essentially provides counseling and mental health services to address the underlying issues contributing to criminal behavior. Another one could be reducing overcrowding, and some ways to do that could be sentencing reform. So reviewing and reforming sentencing laws to ensure that penalties are proportionate to the crimes committed, with a focus on alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenses. And that could lead to a second possible reform in the reducing overcrowding subsection, which could be bail reform that addresses pretrial detention issues by reforming bail practices and ensuring that individuals are not held in jail solely due to an inability to pay bail. Now I'm going to be diving deeper into a subsection of prison reform, which is mass incarceration, which is a pretty big problem, and it relates to significant and sustained increase in the number of individuals held in prisons or jails in a particular country or geographical region. And this includes overcrowded prisons, strained resources within the criminal justice system, and social and economic impacts on individuals and communities. And mass incarceration has also been criticized for disproportionately affecting minority communities. That contributes to systemic inequalities and being an inefficient and costly approach to addressing crime. Some causes of mass incarceration can be tough on crime policies, and that relates to the implementation of strict sentencing laws, three-strike laws, mandatory minimum sentences, and other policies that result in longer prison terms for various offenses. And another could ultimately be war on drugs. So aggressive anti-drug initiatives have basically led to increased arrests and longer sentences for drug-related offenses. And of course, we can't forget the economic factors that also play a role in mass incarceration. And that is essentially the privatization of prisons and the financial incentives associated with incarcerating more individuals that have contributed to the growth of the prison population. Throughout the years, there have been many key reforms that have been proposed or implemented by the public to address said issue, and one of which being sentencing reforms. So reforms like mandatory minimum sentences that reevaluate and reform mandatory minimum sentencing laws, allowing judges more discretion in sentencing, particularly for nonviolent offenses. Another part of the subsection in sentencing reform could be three-strike laws that basically reconsider and reform three-strike laws that mandate life sentences for individuals convicted of multiple offenses, often resulting in lengthy sentences for nonviolent crimes. And as I mentioned before, drug policy reform can also be a type of reform, and this involves decriminalization, and that is basically considering decriminalizing certain nonviolent drug offenses, treating substance abuse as a public health issue rather than solely a criminal one. And we can also have a type of alternative sentencing that implements alternative sentencing options such as drug courts, diversion programs, and rehabilitation for individuals with substance abuse issues. Now we're going to be talking about ways in which addressing racial disparities could also help mass incarceration reforms. The first part of this is essentially eliminating racial profiling. So implement policies to eliminate racial profiling and bias in laws enforcement to address the disproportionate impact of mass incarceration on minority communities. And this actually plays a bigger part in mass incarceration than you would think. Another option could be investment in social services and basically addressing the root causes and investing in social services such as education, healthcare, and housing to address the underlying factors that contribute to criminal behavior.
In reflecting our exploration of the juvenile justice system and the broader issues surrounding mass incarceration and prison reforms, it becomes evident that our criminal justice system is at a critical juncture. The narratives we've uncovered shed light on the challenges faced by young individuals navigating the juvenile justice system and the systemic flaws contributing to mass incarceration. As we go forward, it is imperative to recognize the interconnectedness of these issues and the shared goal of fostering a more just and rehabilitation approach. As we go forward, it is imperative to recognize the interconnectedness of these issues and the shared goal of fostering a more just and rehabilitative approach.